Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us today. This is a talk with my colleagues, Applicco. I just wanted to mention that if you looked at the newsletter that came out originally, you would have seen that we would have been joined by Scott Collier. Unfortunately, Scott is unwell today, so I'll ask my colleagues here to my left to actually pick up the little area that Scott was going to talk. I'm quite pleased that I've got Alex and Steve here to talk about the documents that we've been working with. And we've been working with a couple of our colleagues, which is Scott Collier of Evolution, which is Penn, and also we're talking to Andrew Eve of K International. And we got these two guys to come out of the underwriting side, because I'm a believer that claims is an integral part of underwriting. And when I was speaking to Scott earlier on about this, his view was exactly the same. And as an underwriter, he was very keen to highlight the importance of the underwriting being involved in claims TPA and all the mechanics around that. And there are numerous reasons why, and I'm sure I needn't go through and explain that again. Last couple of days we've issued a press release which picks this area up, and we've been looking at this for a short while, and I'm sure my colleagues here will actually explain about that as we go forward. You'll be pleased to know that Alex has spent 33 years in insurance, 21 within claims companies and operations. He did actually spend 14 years at Girling, and the last 12 he's actually been as a consultant. And like his colleague Steve, they are founding directors of Applicco, which started in 2012. Steve, on the other hand, is a little older. You wouldn't believe it, but he is. He's actually done 40 years. And, of course, his principal background is as a liability adjuster. So these guys are well equipped to help us when we go forward. I'll do no more, and I'll actually hand over to my colleagues.
Yes, thank you, Peter, for that introduction. Just to slightly expand on that, we're an audit and consultancy business, we started off in the claims sector, but very much now across the claims and underwriting piece. Based in the London market, we started in 2012, although we've been working together some time before that. We very much use the Lloyd's market and the Lloyd's principles as our basis, as our start point. We understand that not everybody is working within that regime, but we find it a very good default position to start from. We've also our business has very much taken us into the sector of the MGAA and the wonderful world of Mr. Stadden, and we're very pleased to become supplier members in October of 2014, I should say, and hence the work that we've been doing to produce this document. I just mentioned at this stage, there are copies of the document obviously on your seat. I think there were some outside. If anybody would like an electronic version, please do let us know. Hopefully you've got our email. Contact Peter, and we'll be delighted to let you have a copy. Okay, so our experience is very much across the sector, from both insurance company suppliers working the company and the Lloyd's market, also from the TPA service provider sector. And as Peter said, I'd like to give due credit and thanks for the input and hard work of Scott Collier, formerly of Evolution, now Penn, and Andrew Ede at K International, and indeed from Peter, to get this whole process and document out. Very important, as Peter said, that we got it right from the start, from the underwriters' demands and perspectives, and we'll try and come back to that at the close of this. So that's briefly us. That's the agenda for today. Why did the MGAA identify this issue? What's the relevance of the very timely publishing of the FCA thematic review? what is the role of the external claims service provider as we see it, what are the processes, guidelines that we think will be helpful for the selection of service providers, how that methodology works, the contract documents associated with that, and then moving on to how that whole process is monitored, managed, how it's audited, how it's recorded, and then we just really want to close with looking at the whole piece as a circle of a contract. So that's what we're setting out to do, as ever we need to emphasise what are the learning points that we're seeking to. There's obviously a huge range of experience in this room, but this is basically what we're trying to achieve. We want to set out what the regulatory framework is and how the FCA works within that as we perceive it. We need to very clearly recognise that, as I'm sure you do understand, how important the selection and actions of external service providers can have a huge impact on your business, particularly in this day and age when margins are extremely tight. We want to be able to outline what we think are the appropriate processes and controls which might be helpful to evaluate and report on the performance of service providers, and to have a better understanding of the risks associated. Again, apologies, I'm sure that you all very much know this, but to highlight those risks associated if that process is not comprehensive and effective. And indeed to close by outlining how the whole process of the contract is a cycle, and what documentation is required to validate that process. So moving on to why did we perceive that the MGA saw this as an issue that needed to be addressed. I think firstly, what we have to recognise is that the vast majority of members of the MGAA will in some sense be likely to be outsourcing some, if not all, of their claims investigation and handling functions to external service providers. In these circumstances, as we see it, the MGA's internal claims teams very much take the role of overseeing and managing that process, and perhaps directing and controlling some of the larger, more significant claims that come out of things. Secondly, and this is a theme that we'll reiterate throughout, so I make no apology for that, we have started with the Lloyd's principles. We think it's a good place to start. We think it's a good frame of reference. We understand that that's not applicable. We understand that companies operating outside the Lloyd's sector will choose to pick and choose what is appropriate to them. But we do think it provides a very good base in terms of best practice, minimum standards as a frame of reference. We also recognise that the MGAA companies come in a huge variety of shapes and sizes, and just looking down the list of attendees today, that's very apparent, and a couple of people had the opportunity to speak to. So we understand it's not one size fits all. What we're trying to do is to provide some general guidelines, some general pointers to what we think is relevant, which is fundamentally relevant to, or hopefully relevant to everybody. This is not intended to be a set of rules. It is intended to be a guideline, and very much from our perspective as practitioners who are out there, and we're working at all ends of all levels of the supply chain, so from the capacity providers through to the MGAs, the cover holders, and indeed with the service providers. So we're working up and down the chain. Okay, so basically, our understanding is that Peter is, of course, quite capable of speaking for himself, but our understanding is that the requirement is that there was a perceived need to assist some members with some sort of uniform guideline. As I say, we recognise that the majority of MGA members will outsource. We recognise that there's a variety of size and complexity. But what we do think is that all members share that same basic underlying principle in terms of how they want to conduct their business and to meet the ever more demanding regulatory requirements. And of course recognise those very clear and obvious risks to the MGA members if indeed that process is not under control. When we wrote this, there was a forthcoming FCA thematic review. In actual fact, that has subsequently been published, and we'll come on to that during the talk, but very much reiterates the issues that we've tried to highlight here. Well, I'll come back to the thematic review, but just a couple more points. Sorry, I'm told I'm not clear enough. I'll do that. There are some underlying principles here that have clearly been identified. The first is that obviously responsibility for the selection of external providers very much remains with the company that appointed them. It may be self-evident, but worth reminding us. Also that it's clear that there needs to be transparency around the selection process, so that proper procedures can be demonstrated as being applied and utilised. It's very important that in selecting an external service provider that their authority is very clearly established and the limits of those authorities established and properly documented, and that these need to be supported by very detailed managements and controls procedures. Reporting guidelines, which will be touched on, are a critical factor, particularly where you've got a service provider who's managing a very significant financial fund or exposure. Auditing, I make no apology for mentioning that. It's very much a theme of the FCA, that regular auditing does need to take place. And finally, that there is a process, there is a cycle here, there is feedback. So there is a selection, there's a management, and there's a feedback into the whole underwriting process. So the FCA, very timely publication of the report, as I say, from our point. We'd already worked on this document and we got it out. Our understanding is that these are the key points that have been made. There are clearly concerns over the issue of oversight of outsourced arrangements on part of the FCA. There is a concern, whether it's well-founded or not, that in some cases there might be a lack of consideration for the regulatory obligations of the selector of the service provider. We know that conduct risk is a very, very strong theme, and that certainly came out very, very clearly from this thematic review and is unlikely to recede. The FCA made a particular point about the importance of due diligence and that process. There's a number of ways this can be addressed, and we'll come on to that. But that in the selection process there is a methodology, and it is clear, and that there is a concern that there should be proper control over outsourced claims functions. And I think one of the conclusions that was very clearly reached was that there is the FCA certainly perceive from their findings that there's quite a variance in the quality of oversight that's applicable to this process. Just a very brief comment before I hand over to my colleague on that. We're out there in the market, and we are seeing people at all levels in this process. We don't necessarily. We understand the FCA's observations, and as a broad brush, I'm sure we agree that they're valid, but it is a very broad brush. What we're seeing is that generally there is a very clear desire on the part of everybody involved in the process to deliver a very high standard of service. Now, it's not always achieved, but so that's a caveat that we'd certainly like to put out from our own observations of the market. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Steve Ford, who's now going to pick up with the detail.
The problem with going second is you sit there thinking, I hope he's not going to say the things I'm just about to say. So if I repeat some of the things that have been commented on, I apologise. When we were asked to look to put this guide together, it was with that in mind. It's a guide. It's not a set of rules that the MGAA are wishing to impose. It's a guide. And it's also a guide based on our interpretation of what Lloyd's in particular are looking at, and based on, if you like, our skew on how the market is. We recognise that it is a broad brush approach that we've had to take because there are various ways that you all do business. But bearing that in mind, what we try to do is just to set out how we see things in various parts of the business. So I've been asked to sort of look at the core of the document. As Alex said, there are documents available to take away. We've had to carry them a long distance. They're very heavy. Please take them away, because otherwise we're going to have to take them home again. And we don't want to be doing that. You can all read that for yourselves. The Lloyd's Minimum Standards definition of external experts. What I wanted to touch on initially is three areas. What is the role of the external claims service provider? What do you need from the providers, and what processes and controls must they have in place? So, taking the first part, the role of the external claims service provider. Our view is this, that under a delegated authority arrangement, the service provider is seen to be effectively an extension of the MGA or the contracting parties team, with a clear mandate to protect the interests of the parties, the insurers and the insured at all times. Their role is to represent the instructing party to the insured and the policyholder in a competent and professional manner. There should be, and this is very clear from everything we've seen, a line, what's described as a line of sight between the MGA and the insured and the policyholder. That is to say that you have the responsibility to ensure that the insurance contracts and associated claims are handled timely, accurately and fairly. And the role of the service provider is to support you in that. It's effectively not get in the way of that relationship, but to support it. They need to have a role in convincing you or satisfying you of their ability to meet the terms of the service contract and to provide a continuity and a longevity of service where it's required. They must have the required expertise to investigate, handle, to negotiate claims. They must have the ability to correctly allocate reserves and to review and update such reserves in a timely manner. They should have the capacity to provide detailed claims data, and I know that's sometimes a bit of a tricky one in defining the data that's required, but they should have the ability to do that. And where authorised to do so, they should have the ability to safely handle claimed funds and provide detailed financial reports. I guess if we were to take a straw poll before I spoke, we would probably get similar answers from everybody around the room. So, in that we're not actually telling you anything, I guess, that you don't already know. But what do you need from your provider? Well, our view is that there is no one size that fits all. It very much depends on the portfolio type. So we've looked at what do you need? Well, you need price, possibly. Where you're dealing with a complex and relatively low volume claims account, our view is that price is unlikely to be top of your agenda. But of course, a lot of accounts are high volume, low value, particularly in areas such as motor or household, where the accounts themselves, the risks themselves are highly price sensitive, and therefore the cost to you of buying those services from the service provider is particularly important. There is the value, and here we're talking about not whether the service provider provides the cheapest price, but whether they provide the best value services. And in that we're talking about not only the ability to handle the claims, but to provide high levels of expertise, adherence to service standards, data provision, value-added services, and obviously things like locations. Probably more pertinent, more relevant where there's a complex claims portfolio with relatively low volumes. We consider technical excellence. I think technical competence has got to be a given. We would say that to all service providers. Technical competence has to be a given. The question you've got to raise is, do you need technical excellence? And by that we mean that you can pay an awful lot of money to buy the highest quality of service that you can get. Does that actually fit to what your portfolio requires? And in some regards, the answer is, well, you don't need the highest level in all areas of the business. What you need is a blended set of skills provided by your service providers. Yes, to include some staff who are at the highest level of the business, but not necessarily all staff. Geographical spread, again, depends on the portfolio, and there, what the service provider is able to deliver depends on the way that they're set up. Some offer multi-class, multi-territory handling under a single corporate banner. Others work in alliance relationships with other service providers in different territories. They've both got strengths, they've both got weaknesses. I'm not going to go into them here, but it's for you, I guess, as the buyer of services to decide which is the route you want to go down. Data provision I've touched on. A key requirement from all parties. In fact, to such an extent, we would say that it really should be part of any due diligence exercise at the outset of a contract. Sometimes it is something that follows on the process. It's not foremost when the contract is entered into with the TPA or the service provider, and we would suggest that it's of sufficient importance that it should be right at the forefront. And obviously that depends on the type and the viability and the visibility of their systems, their ability to provide you with instant and accurate updates, and in some cases to provide viewable records. And we believe that these things should be incorporated within the contract terms, the SLA and the KPIs. There's the security, obviously. You want to make sure if you're entering into a contract with these people that they're still going to be around. In terms of the processes, the required processes, the Lloyd's minimum standards states that the managing agents should have in place processes and controls to ensure that providers comply with key minimum standards. The rationale being that where the provider acts for the MGA under a delegated authority, they'll be subject to the same requirements as the MGA themselves to act in accordance with the minimum standards. And in there we're talking about the processes in place for the service provider to incorporate things like resource planning, resource management, claims processes, file reviews, claims reserving, their ability to appoint external experts on your behalf under terms of engagement, and management of said experts. Within the guide, we then looked at the selection and the suitability criteria. And again, looking at the slide here, it makes clear that the managing agent is responsible for determining that the authorised party is competent to perform its responsibilities. Again, reiterating, we recognise that not all MGAA members will be governed by Lloyd's regulation. But it is just worth reminding ourselves that under the Code of Practice, there is a requirement that the provider should be assessed against the minimum suitability criteria contained within the intermediaries bylaw. So just echoing the previous slide, what we're talking about there in terms of the suitability criteria is competency, is the adequacy of resource, suitable processes and procedures to be in place, suitable management controls to be in place, capital and financial resources, appropriate data security methods, financial safeguards, and suitable risk management. Ensure that they are still around, and there's longevity of service. It also goes further, the ability to review claims estimates, the ability to identify and resolve conflicts of interest are also important. What Lloyds do say is that there is a clear responsibility upon the purchasing party, the MGA in this case, to ensure that the chosen provider is appropriate and meets the suitability criteria. So, armed with such criteria, we looked at the selection methodology with reference to Lloyd's Code of Practice, Part 8 of Claims. Pre-placement managing agents should have procedures in place documenting the decision-making process. Now, our view in terms of the selection methodology, the way that you go about procuring the services of a provider is pretty much up to you. There are no right and wrong answers. What there is, however, is a need for certain things. There is a need that the method should be fully documented. There is a need that the methodology should be transparent around the selection process. So somebody coming in, trying to understand what you're doing, should be able to understand it very clearly. The MGAs should document the reasons why the successful provider was chosen, and the selection documentation should reference the suitability criteria, so you can demonstrate clearly that you're taking on board all these points. As I said, the selection methods are entirely up to the individual parties, and certainly from our viewpoint, and when we are asked to look at this, we don't favour one above the other. And that can be recommendation, it could be previous experience of the provider, it could be meetings or beauty parades, it could be due diligence and auditing, it could be a formal tender exercise, it could be questionnaires, or you might want to go down the route of outsourcing procurement experts. What we would say to our clients is, provided the transparency and the documentation around the methodology is used, which way you go doesn't really matter. As Alex mentioned, due diligence is very important, and the Lloyd's minimum standards, MS11, make that very clear. You can probably read that quicker than I could, to yourselves, quicker than I can read it out. So it's on the screen. We can all see what it says. But there is a requirement that in certain circumstances due diligence should be undertaken as part of the selection criteria. It's clearly not relevant to all portfolios. In some cases it simply may not be cost effective to go down that route. But there are instances, large portfolios, complex accounts, perhaps where a sole provider of services is appointed, where due diligence may well be worth considering. We do undertake due diligence reviews, and the areas that we look at on behalf of our clients are things like management resources, staffing levels and their technical proficiency applicable to the specific claims portfolio, the geographical spread, the internal claims processes, the data security, the management information and bordereau provision that they can give you, the fund holding arrangements, the adequacy of the E&O cover that they've got, and their compliance and regulatory processes and procedures. I'm sure other parties, other people standing here may have a different approach to what would be included in the due diligence exercise. That's certainly the way we would interpret it, and that's the way we would approach it. Having gone down the route of picking your expert, understanding what you want from them, and then appointing them, we've looked at the contract documentation, again with reference to the intermediaries bylaw, which makes it very clear that there should be comprehensive and suitable written agreements for delegated claims handling authorities. I have to say, in all fairness, that we generally find that is indeed the case. It certainly is something that the market has got on board, and I think it's probably correct to say that we, in every audit that we do now, every review we do now, we do see very detailed contract documentation. And there we're looking at things like contract price, contract period, contract scope, the authority limits. The service provider, the TPA, is very much like to know what their authority limits are, what they're working to, and what's required of them. They would like to know what the reporting procedures are. Data revision, which we seem to keep coming back to. The fund holding arrangements. The service levels and the KPIs, the measurables, the things that you're actually going to assess them against. And the termination agreement. There are others. There's things like geographical limits. There's sub-delegation agreements, sub-delegation terminology that you can have in the contract. The need for audit can be incorporated in the contract. And as I'm sure some of the TPAs around here will attest to, the issue of their fees, what they're going to get paid and when they're going to get paid. All these things need to be incorporated. So far so good. Having engaged with them, having had the contract with the TPAs, the service providers, we're looking at how you actually go about monitoring and managing them. And again, there is the Code of Practice, Part 8, which refers to the need to have sufficient processes, key performance indicators and controls to manage and evaluate the performance of the service providers. Minimum standards 2, MS2, also talks about the service provider being monitored, and if the standards are not met, the MGAA to have the ability to restrict or terminate the delegation. So there's a clear duty upon the purchaser of services to ensure that the claims portfolio is handled correctly by their service provider, accurately and fairly. The methods used to evaluate your providers, again, they're variable and they're varied, and it depends on the complexity of the portfolio and the way that you engage. But as a standard, we would suggest you're looking at obviously everything being embedded within the contract, having very clear service level agreement in place so that the TPA, the service provider, knows exactly what they're being measured against. Rolling off of that are the KPIs. Monitoring via management information is increasingly the norm these days. We see that being used more and more. Financial reporting, obviously particularly when they've got fund holding arrangements. Exception reporting as part of the management information suite. we do tend to find that a lot of service providers these days do capture an awful lot of information, which can be very useful. And what it does do is to identify very clearly where things are not being done. So the exception reporting is a very valuable tool. And then, of course, you've got review meetings, which I'm sure you would all have. And then auditing. Unashamedly, this is important to us. This is, frankly, how we make our money. So we would endorse the view that audits are terribly, terribly important to the market. Certainly terribly, terribly important to us. But again, there is a requirement, as you can see with on the screen, that the managing agent should have an audit framework in place. There is a recommendation under Minimum Standards 2 that audits should be carried out annually, unless otherwise documented. And Minimum Standards 11 with conduct risk also determines that there should be the establishment of an audit process in relation to conduct risk on an annual basis. So, audits may include, what we've done is we've just personalised really, this is what we do within our audit process. I know that there are variations on a theme. So we look at operational reviews, and when we go into a service provider we are looking at their management, we're looking at their team skills and numbers, and expertise. We're looking at carrying out a review of their operational processes and procedures, how it's documented and how it's followed through. We're looking at a detailed review of their systems, including MI provision, data accuracy, an assessment against the minimum standard requirements that have been set down, and a validation of their adherence to the service level agreement and key performance indicators, all really as part of the operational review. We would also look at regulatory and conduct reviews, and in that we're looking at the way that they can respond to your demands in relation to things like management of conflicts, management of complaints, recording of complaints, treating customers fairly, anti-bribery legislation, and currently sanctions as well. We would naturally carry out technical claims reviews. That's not only looking at what they do, but also looking at where there's leakage, so we can identify any leakage within the claims portfolio. We would generally recommend staff interviews. The reason for this is that the management will tell us A, and the staff will often tell us B. So it's interesting to get the ground floor view of what the service provider is providing and what their staff understand is the requirements. Financial and reconciliation reviews. So we would look at fund holding arrangements and reporting. We'd also try to provide a gap analysis assessment. So what the service level agreement, what the KPIs require against what is delivered. And we'd also try to come up with some recommendations to try and work with the service provider to make sure that they can adhere to the services that are being asked for. But just to reinforce the point Alex has made, and going back to the FCA thematic review, audits shouldn't be seen as a panacea or a substitute to robust internal controls. I think the FCA talked about audits as being the third line of defence. I think that's probably a fair comment. They are important, but what is more important is getting the processes in place at the beginning and monitoring throughout the life of the portfolio. And then we just touched on central records, is very, very quickly on this. We do recommend the creation of a central database of all providers, a link to key contract documentation to provide provider details, standard documentation, compliance documentation, monitoring and or audit records. The reason in being is that as a portfolio grows, various documents are entered into, various documents are created. Where we've talked to clients, we find that there's often the records are spread across various parts of the organisation. So what we are saying to our clients is bring them into a central record, so that if you do have a review by the regulatory bodies. You've got everything in one place.
Right. Just to wrap this up and hopefully give sufficient time for questions. The contract cycle we've spoken about, and I think it's absolutely critical that we do regard this as a cycle that needs to be completed. Like any wheel, if there's a weak spoke or a spoke missing, it's not going to function efficiently. Through the pre-engagement process to the striking of the contract, the management monitoring of that whole process, to audit, which we talked about as a necessary backstop, but not as the critical driver. Back to contract review, the renewal process. And I guess our observation as practitioners is probably it's that sort of last part in the circle and beginning part of the circle that we see perhaps is not always given the attention that it should. The contract's there increasingly. There was a time when contracts weren't there so much, but they're very much more. The management monitoring is there. The audit is increasingly coming into play as an effective process. But what we do see is that this feedback, this contract review renewal, back into the whole engagement or re-engagement process. Perhaps that's an area that could have a little more of a stronger focus. Couple of key things very quickly. Tools of that sort of management process would be regular management information reports, which clearly show how the SLAs and the KPIs are performing. A review of the actual claims data, to see how the portfolio is going. Ad hoc feedback reports, very valuable, less structured. Complaints, a very good indicator and something that certainly the FCA are very focused on. Looking back at past meetings, just looking back at the minutes of previous review meetings, what was intended, what was set out, has it been achieved? And last but by no means least, of course, audit reports. So that's really all I want to say on the contract cycle. So that really should lead us back to the beginning again and to our objectives here, which hopefully we've achieved. What we've tried to do is to look at the regulatory environment and particularly the place of the FCA in that and the significance of their role and the very real position that we're all in that we need to act or we're going to be obliged to react to what the FCA are saying, which of course is not always entirely clear. We have to interpret that. We've tried to look at, to set the scene with what we regard as the impact of service providers to your business of all shapes and sizes. Hopefully, we've set out some sort of general, positive, constructive and helpful guidelines in terms of how we think the engagement process and the management process should work. And conversely, touched on the risks that are involved if that process is not adequately and correctly managed. And I think finally, we've tried to do the classic helicopter of lifting up above the whole thing and seeing this as a whole cycle of contract, which is not going to do the job unless it's completed and feeds back into the process. Again. So I'd like to thank you very much for your time and your attendance, and really open up the floor now to any questions that you might have.
Alex, thanks for that, and Steve, thanks very much for that. Whilst you're thinking about the particular questions, we have got a microphone here, and we'll bring that to you if you have a question. I just wanted to make the point, and Steve made a very interesting point with regard to cost. May I just remind you that one of the things that was not in the Insurance Act that is certainly going through on the enterprise bill, and that looks at potential consequential loss due to late payment of claims. Now, when we look at potential consequential loss, as far as I can see from looking at the revised document that's still going through its processes, that could be quite frightening. You could end up with a £100,000 loss and a con loss on the back of that of 10 million. So the idea here of actually having these management information there so we can monitor what's going on, because you can bet your bottom dollar if something comes down the line on somebody other than yourselves, the regulator is going to be jumping up and down like a lunatic. So we need to make sure that we've got these processes in. And complaints is a very, very good benchmark that we can look at where the complaint's coming in from. So we've got to make sure we've got our information together. So, ladies and gentlemen, the floor is yours. So questions, please. Can you please identify yourself? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jane Nicholson. I'm the Syndicate Manager for a syndicate at Lloyd's. I'm very interested in the statement and the comment that's in the guide where you say due diligence is not appropriate for all, always not necessary for all claim portfolios. Due diligence, by any other name, is kicking the tyres. So whatever your selection process is, it's about going to check what people do. So I just kind of wanted your feedback on where you think it's not appropriate.
I think we're probably recognising, and it's a point we try to emphasise, the huge variety of sizes and shapes of the membership of the MGAA. I guess your question is, why is it not appropriate? And of course it is always appropriate. But I guess what we're trying to recognise there is the practicality of the extent to which you conduct that. And I suppose we're talking about a very formal due diligence process. You're absolutely right. I mean, due diligence has to be conducted to some extent in every case.
Good. I thought that was what you were going to say, so I'm just delighted to hear it. It's always relevant, but it needs to be appropriate, and I think that's what we all understand.
Yes, proportionate.
Thank you. Any more questions from the floor? It looks, guys, like you've got them foxed. Well done. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in thanking Steve and Alex for an excellent presentation?